about this some more because we did last time.
We're now joined by Sam Bradshaw, S11. He studies a lot of things, including football, X's and O's, and much more. We have Sam on usually on Fridays during football season, and he joins us on SICEM 365 Radio and 365 Sports. Now, Sam, thank you very much. You wrote an article that came out in the premium section, Stop the Propaganda, the truth about Big 12 versus Pac-12 TV numbers. We couldn't quite get you on Friday because of your schedule. What was behind all this? And is it because of some of the columnists trying to prop up the Pac-12 numbers?
Thanks for having me on. And truth be told, I was actually taking the numbers that I had and beginning to do a television rating series, and comparing the two is going to be like Article 4 in the series. But then you just have 3 or 4 different national writers with leaning towards the Pac-12 come out with some pretty misleading numbers at the beginning of last week. So I switched the order and put out the article, just adding some additional context to how those numbers got to where they are, and really showing that a lot of the conclusions they're reaching weren't really supported by the data.
Well, Sam, just kind of broad strokes before we throw up some of these graphics that you sent. The data, to me, especially when you look at the overall numbers over a couple of games for all this, is from...
We have graphics we're going to put up?
Yeah, we do.
Okay.
We do. But, you're talking about from 3 million to the middle of 2.13 between various different schools. There's not that much of a drop-off between any of these schools, is there?
Not really. Oregon's probably way out in front if you were going to do one team has to be in front, but everybody's a lot closer to each other than Kansas is to just about anybody. Kansas, it's the net result of having a decade plus of being at the absolute bottom of what you could potentially do win-loss record-wise. And, so they're struggling. But apart from that, there's really not a whole lot of spread among these brands when you look at average rating once you even out how many games you're sampling.
All right, so Garrett, put up the pie chart or the bar chart graphic that he sent here real quick so we can talk about it. Okay, so when you look at this one right here, this is Oregon at 3 million all the way down to Kansas at 680-something thousand. So that's not precipitous team to team. I mean, it goes down as kind of the size of the market and brands go down, but kind of explain this one with Oregon at 3 million all the way down to Kansas at 687,000, where the data is over this 2.5 games or 2.56 games that you did per school.
Right. Well, the first thing you got to understand, and the other graphic that I sent with kind of the hockey stick graph will give you a better idea. College football ratings, they go really big at the top games that an individual school or conference has, and then everything else is making up a much smaller percentage of the cumulative viewership. I think like the top 15 to 17% of games got half of the total cumulative viewership of all the games in my data. So the further you go down a team's schedule, the more you're adding in the weaker games that aren't adding in much of anything. So if you're taking the top games of one school against all of the games of another school, that's going to, and maybe you might be able to find one of the weaker teams in the country and compare them against Bama, and it might still tell you that Bama's better. But generally speaking, if you're comparing any schools that are remotely comparable, having different sample sizes is going to invalidate what you're doing from the very get-go. So the chart where all the schools were ranked, that chart, let's just take the same number of games for all these schools, and let's set the number of games at the minimum number of games it takes to get everybody. I think Colorado had 23 games over the 9 seasons that I sampled for that analysis. So everybody's top 23 games was sampled against each other, and that's how I got that rating. If you just do a simple average, or if you try and do average of what your home game ratings are, but you don't account for sample size, you get absurd things like, I think Stuart Mandel's article had all of the top 5 and 7 of the top 9 were in the Pac-12. Well, yeah, because you're ignoring all of their worst games, yet everybody playing Kansas is dragging ours down. Everybody playing the FCS team or the group of 5 teams that happen to be on nationally rated networks is dragging down the Big 12 averages. So it's just a flawed analysis to begin with. So the two things that this article set out to do is let's put even sample sizes together, so it's apples to apples, and then going even further, there was a difference in how often you appeared on different networks. And depending on what time of day you're on and depending on which network you're on, it can make a wild difference in your viewership numbers. So let's compare how they do, same day of the week, same channel, same time of day. Who does better when they both appear on the same time? Because the Pac-12 is not appearing at noon, and at least as far as conference games are going, the Big 12 is not appearing in the late night after dark slot.
Yeah, and Garrett's going to put that graphic up on the screen of the windows matter and the networks matter in that, and some of that isn't just who you are. It's kind of luck of the draw based on the season too, right? That you might have gotten the 3:30 window on ABC.
Right. I mean, it depends on how you're doing that season. It depends on what other games are up against you. It depends on contractual minimums. For instance, does ESPN have a certain number of games they absolutely have to put on the Sun Belt, for instance, on one of their networks? That might kick you down to ESPNU if they have a major conference team playing at a Sun Belt school, because they'd rather do that than show ULM versus Troy. They'd rather show South Carolina at ULM, for instance. So if they have a way to mitigate the damage that some of those minimums would have, you've got so many business interests going in here. But as you can see on the chart here, of the Fox, ESPN, and ABC windows that the two conferences had in common, the Big 12 won almost, or at least the vast majority of them. They, quote unquote, won. They had higher numbers, but it's very close. And this is two conferences where before the departures, the Big 12 was comfortably ahead. But after the 4 schools left the two conferences, it's gotten to be pretty even. So all these articles coming out saying that this conference is so ahead of that conference and blah, 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 it's really not taking the data into account in a way that I think is fair.
All right, can you explain this next one, the one that's the kind of the lines, Garrett, this one right here, that one. All right, this is the remaining 8 and Pac-10 games per year average viewers of conference games over 8 years, excluding title games and the people who left. So these are the teams that are left. Nobody's coming in. This is just who's left in both leagues. Can you explain what this one kind of shows?
Yes, this one shows basically however many games per year each of these schools is being averaged is a data point. So on the left, it's like your top third of a game, which over 9 seasons, that's like your top 3 games. Your 1 game per year is 9 games, 2 games per year is 18, so on and so forth. It's a way to see how they behave over different times, because depending on how many you're sampling, Washington State might be ahead of Utah or it might not be. Different schools perform better at different sample sizes. Just they sometimes have like a top game that's massive and is more get averaged in. They don't hold it as well. Others have more big games, so on and so forth. But what you get is each of these schools at each point on the graph is being compared on an equal number of games. So you get to see not only who's better at each data point, but you also get to see, as things go on, who's holding up over time, or are two tracking pretty similarly. Iowa State and Arizona State on this chart are almost in lockstep with each other. But if you took an average of all the games you had available, which is a lot of what these analyses do that have gone national, those analyses, they would be comparing the farthest right point on Iowa State to the farthest right point on Arizona State, which is several points on the graph apart from each other. So where these two have behaved almost identically on this chart, a simple average would completely distort that and completely mislead the situation.
The top level, by the way, leave it up for a second, Garrett. It's Oregon at the top, and then, of course, near the end, you start to see the Baylor. Is that the Sugar Bowl game? And, of course, the Big 12 championship game that got huge numbers as well. But then you have Oklahoma State. That's the yellow with the black triangles. And then after that, Baylor. Washington's in the middle of that mix, as you could imagine. Yeah, Kansas, unfortunately, at the bottom, not doing very well. Was there any team in particular? We heard about Washington State being maybe a school that had better viewership than most ever thought, and that's surely not supposed to be up. Is there anybody that surprised you in all this, Sam?
Washington State did really well. They had some really good spotlight games when Mike Leach was there. They've typically had a Black Friday TV window for the Apple Cup, which is Washington State, that typically does pretty well. So they did better than you expected. This chart does not include bowl games. It does not include title games. So Baylor did better than I thought they would, but TCU does well. Utah actually surprised me a little bit. They did pretty well. But the top four for the Big 12 have typically been, for the years that I've run this kind of analysis, for the remaining Big 12, it's typically been Oklahoma State, Baylor, TCU, and West Virginia as one kind of key group at the top. And then you have basically everybody else, and then Kansas way in the back. For the Pac-12, Oregon actually outpaced USC for the vast majority of data points. So Oregon is clearly their top dog. But limiting it to conference games probably hurts Stanford because they have that annual date with Notre Dame that helps them immensely.
Well, and look, you have a data point like that. Notre Dame helps them immensely, but you look at everything you sent. Kansas's abject failure as a program over the last decade is a lot further down than, say, Arizona's or anybody else. So the Big 12 has its own kind of outlier at every step of the way that I know you can't take out, but is certainly a factor.
Oh, it's certainly a factor. If I did a remaining 7 average compared to the remaining Pac-10, you'd be talking 100,000 or more better than you otherwise would be once you average all the games in and do an equal sample size. It definitely impacts things, but when you get an even number of games for the remaining Big 12 and remaining Pac-10 and compare them, even numbers per school, you end up almost identical. Whether you limit the number of Big 12 games or you try and provide a generous estimate for what the games that are on the Pac-12 network might get if they were on ESPNU or FS1, for instance, either way you slice it, it ends up almost identical. They're very close to each other. And, you really kind of have to go down into the individual TV windows. And at one point it just becomes, all right, they're on late and they're on at noon. Other than that, they're very similar.
One of the things in the chat, and Sam, we appreciate your time and all the graphics of what you did. Basically, it's pretty similar, right? I mean, you're talking about there's not much difference between the two, but if anyone tries to paint that picture, that's the propaganda you're talking about.
Well, that was the title put on after I was done. But, if you're trying to put on the idea that this conference after defections is way ahead of the other one in raw TV ratings, I don't think the data supports that. As far as business interest and what they might get in terms of payouts, there's all kind of estimates being thrown around. I included one of the more credible ones in the article. But, it's really up to the business need because 2 examples of both ESPN and Fox making business moves to protect their interests that the valuation probably would have suggested they would have gone a different way is a decade ago, both of them not only didn't flash the Big 12 TV deal when Nebraska left, but they also ESPN came out with the Longhorn Network, which really helped root Texas into the Big 12 for the following decade. And then secondly, Fox, when Syracuse, Pitt, and West Virginia and Notre Dame all left the Big East, Fox was launching Fox Sports 1. They didn't really have much in the way of college basketball content at the time. So they, in my opinion, dramatically overpaid for the 7 Catholic schools in the Big East to break off, go raid Xavier, Creighton, and Butler, and form what we now know as the Big East and leave the American. Both of which, their business needs superseded what the estimates would have been for either of those moves.
Sam, thank you, man. Appreciate your time, and look forward to the X's and O's talk with you on Fridays during the football season.
Sounds great.
Thank you very much, Sam Bradshaw, Baylor under.